Hello and welcome to the training for the NDIS Budget Tracker spreadsheet. So before we get into demoing the spreadsheet, I thought it'd be a good idea to explain why this sheet was made. So in May of 2025, the NDIS rolled out a new concept called funding periods. And this is essentially where a plan is broken down into multiple sections or periods where funds are allocated to that specific period. So the default is 3 months. So that means if you've got a 1-year plan, it will now be broken down into 4 3-month periods. So this has made it very difficult for people to budget because you can't spend the money from a future period in a current period. So we made this sheet to hopefully make it easier for people to allocate their spend to make sure they don't go over their budget. So a few things to note are that the periods are not aligned to any specific dates. So it's not as though it would be, the 1st of January to the end of March or anything like that. It's an arbitrary random date of simply when the plan started. So it doesn't line up with, for example, the school term or holiday periods or anything like that. It's just every single person will have a different start and end date for their funding periods. Now, any funds that you don't spend in a period get rolled over and you can use them in a future period. However, if there's any funds left over at the end of the entire plan, which would be the last period, then that does not roll over to a new plan that you get. So anyone who is getting a new plan or a reassessed plan will automatically go onto the funding period system. If you've got an existing plan, they will not be changing over straight away. You'll have to wait until you get a new plan or a reassessed plan to switch over to this funding period system. So what this sheet does, it allows you to enter in your funding period information, and then it will generate for you a spreadsheet which will track specifically your funding for your periods. So it allows you to put in both the spend you've already made in the past and any predicted spend in the future, so that you can see if you're going over budget or not. And the most important thing is, you might go over budget in one of the periods and you'll have to pay out of pocket, but then in a future period you may go underneath your budget, but you still have to pay the out of pocket part because you can't bring forward money from future periods into a current period. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you how to work this spreadsheet now. So the first thing we have to do is we have to make a copy of the sheet. So a template's provided, and you have to have a Google account in order to use the sheet. And so you'll make a copy of it, and that copy will be yours. No one else will be able to see it unless you share it with someone else. And you can access it from any computer or device you have. But you do need to have a Google account in order to use this sheet. So down here, there's a link to make a copy of the sheet. So here I'd click on the sheet to make a copy. And on my window, it asks me, do I want to copy it? So I click on make a copy. And then in my Google account, it will now create a copy of this sheet for me. And only I can see this. So the first thing I'll do is I'll rename the sheet to be James's sheet. So now this is my copy. So down the very bottom, you'll see that there's 3 tabs. There's Start Here, funding period data, and example budget sheet. So start here gives you some brief instructions for how to use the sheet. The funding period data allows you to enter in your own personal funding information. And then an example budget sheet just shows you a working example so you can have a look at to see how the sheet works. So what we're going to do is we're going to click on the funding period data sheet. And you'll see here you can enter in the participant's name, any type of category, a provider name if you wish, and then you enter in the funding periods. So each funding period will have a number. So you can see here it's numbered 1 to 8. It will have a start and end date, and it will have a budget. So this information will be directly coming from your NDIS plan. It will literally have each period with the start date, end date, and budget. So it will just be a simple data entry task. Now the category name, for some participants you might have different budgets for different purposes. So for example, you might have a therapy budget and you might have a core budget for consumables. So you can have multiple sheets that track the individual budgets for each category. So I'm going to name this particular one. In this example, I'll leave James Bond as the name. And then in the category, I'm just going to put therapy. And I'll just leave the provider name as a test. And what I'm going to do actually in this example is I'm going to remove the last 4 periods here, and we're just going to have a plan which runs for 1 year. So it's going to be divided into 4 periods, and it's going to go from the 14th of February 2025 and end on the 13th of February 2026. So it's going to have 3-month chunks. And you'll see here for the very first period I've got a budget of $6,000. And then for the subsequent 3 periods, I've got a budget of $4,000 for each period. So once I've entered my data, then I come up to the top here and there's a menu item called NDIS. And I click on that. And there's a button called Generate Budget Sheet. So I click on that. Now it's going to ask me for permission to run this particular script. So we've written the script, so there's all programming behind the scenes which helps you generate the sheet. And this is just asking you if it's okay for you to run it. So I'm going to say okay. And then I'm going to choose the Google account which is running it. And then it comes up and it tells me that this particular script has access to this sheet. And so then I click on continue. And then what will happen is behind the scenes, the script is going to run and it's going to create this sheet for me. And you can see it already creating the sheet. And it now says my budget sheet is ready to use. So it probably takes, maybe 10 or 20 seconds to create. So you'll see down the bottom, there'll be a new sheet that it's created, and it has the name, James Bond, the time period or the dates, which is 25 to 2026, which service provider, and what the category is, which is therapy. So if you wanted to, you could go back to the funding period data and then go and create another sheet for a different category of spend that you're doing. It could be also, if there's multiple people that you're tracking, you could put in multiple people and then it will create multiple tabs down the bottom for different people. So it's up to you how you want to use the sheet. So the first thing you'll see is the sheet is divided into a header, which is this part here. And then there's, and essentially that contains a summary of the information for the whole budget and each period. And then down below that is week by week, what's happening in each week. So if we go up to the top part, we can see it has 4 periods. So period 1, 2, 3, and 4. And for each period, it's going to tell us the start and end date. So the first period is from the 14th of February to the 13th of the 5th. It tells us how many days are in that period. So there's 89 days in the first period. And you'll notice that in the subsequent 3 periods, there's 92 days in each of those periods. So the first period, even though each period is 3 months each, because the months of the year have different days in each month, you'll have a variable amount of days in each period. It then tells me how much budget we've got for this period. So we've got $6,000 in period 1 and $4,000 in period 2. And then it tells us how much money has been rolled over from a past period. So in the first period, there's no money rolled over because we've just started the plan. But at the moment, because I haven't entered any spend in the first period, it tells me if I don't spend anything in period number 1, then $6,000, which is all of period 1 budget, gets rolled over into period 2 for me to use. So in period 2, because I had originally $4,000 and I haven't yet spent anything in period 1, so it's thinking that $6,000 would be rolled over, it means that $10,000 could be used in period 2 if I don't spend any money at all in period 1. So this particular line, the combined budget for period, tells you how much money in total you could spend for that period based on the amount of budget to start off with, plus any money rolled over which is unused from a previous period. So it then tells you how much budget average per day there is. So you'll see it's an average of $67.42 per day. And then how much the average per day I could have over if you include the money rolled over from previous periods which have been unused. And because at the moment I haven't spent anything and I haven't put any plans to spend anything, you'll see in the very last period, if I don't spend any money at all in period 1, 2, or 3, I would have $195 on average a day to spend in period 4. If I just look at how much money just from the budget in period 4, I'd have $43.48 to spend per day on average. It then tells me how much money was spent for the period. And at the moment, because I haven't entered in any spend, it's 0 for all periods. And it tells me how much budget is left over for that particular period. And then it tells me how much money I'll be spending out of pocket. And that is essentially where my spend has gone over the budget. And that's the money that the NDIS won't be paying, and I'd need to pay that out of my own funds. So then, under the whole plan section, it will essentially summarize what's happening with the entire plan, which is, I guess it's periods 1 to 4 combined. So it's telling me the whole plan will be for a year. It will have 365 days. The total budget is $18,000, which is $6,000 plus $4,000 plus $4,000 plus $4,000. And it will tell me on average, it will be $49.32 per day. And currently I've got $18,000 left because I haven't spent anything, and I'm out of pocket nothing as well. Now you can also, if you move your mouse and hover it over these particular headings, it will give you a description as well. So you can always find out a bit more information from doing that. And that's that little black triangle bit at the top of the cell that indicates that there's some helper text there to help you out. So then I come down to the main part of the sheet, and each week will have its own row. So if we look at the first week here, so all of the weeks start on a Monday. So the Monday the 10th of February, and it then tells me which period it is. So I have 4 different sections here for each period. So I've got period 1, period 2, period 3, and period 4. So it then tells me which week of the year this is. So the week starting the 10th of February is the 7th week of the year. We then have each day of the week. So Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. And then we've got a miscellaneous column as well for you to enter in any spend, which is which is miscellaneous. And that might be documentation or reporting that you're expecting to do. So you'll see in the very first week, the first 4 days, it says not in period. And that's because your period starts on the Friday. And that date would be Friday the 14th of the 2nd, 2025. So if you spend any money on the Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, or Thursday, that is not included in this plan because the plan has not yet started. And likewise at the very end of the period ends on Tuesday. So the Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday of this week are not included in this period. So then if we come over here, on the right hand side, it will do some calculations for us. And it will show us the total spend for the week, which would be the combination of all of the days of the week and the miscellaneous. So that's how much in total I would spend for that week. It gives me how much budget is for that particular week. And you'll see that the first week, the budget is a lot lower than the subsequent weeks. And that's because there's only 3 days of the week, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. So it's calculating the budget on a daily basis and then calculating how many days of the week there are to get that weekly budget for you. It then gives you the weekly budget with any rolled over amount from which is unspent from past periods. So that's the calculations for the week. Then over here in the green columns, it's basically doing a cumulative calculations on how much has been spent in the whole funding period as it goes. So as we spend money during the period, this will calculate and show us how much money is spent in total. So for example, here our weekly budget, we started off with $202.25. And then in our second week, our budget is $471.91, which means that total for the total 2 first weeks, our budget is $674.16. And then when we get to the very last week of the period, it will equate to $6,000, which is the budget for our period. So this just gives you a running total of the budget, a running total of the spend, and also the running total of the budget with any unused funds from previous periods. And then the third section over on the right, the whole plan, that gives you the running total of the spend throughout the entire plan. And then also the budget for the entire plan. So down in future periods, like in period 4, we'll get data showing us, well, how much has been spent for the entire plan period. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to enter some data. So I'm going to have a scenario where a participant is going to be having speech pathology and occupational therapy. So they're going to be having occupational therapy on a Friday. So I'm going to put in, and let's say they start on the first day, 193.99. And that's going to be for 1 therapy session on the Friday. So you'll see that it's calculated for this week. I've spent $193.99. And for the period, I've also spent $193.99. And for the whole plan, I've spent $193.99 because I've only had one single day of expense. Now, up in the header, it's told me that for the period, I've spent $193.99, and my budget left over is $5,806.01. So that's how much I've got left for this period. So now what I'm going to do is, because I'm going to have occupational therapy each week, I'm going to press Control C. I'm going to scroll down here and press Control V. And that pastes in the $193.99. So now if we go and have a look, we'll see that my cumulative weekly spend, so each week I'm spending $193. Now for the last week, because the Friday isn't in this funding period, I haven't spent anything in that particular week. So my cumulative spend is $2,000. At the very end of the funding period, I've spent $2,521.87. And if you come up and have a look, for period 1, I've spent that amount, which I just said, and the amount left over is $3,478.13. So for my entire plan, it again gives me the amount I've spent in total, which, because I've only entered in data for period 1, it's the same as the total for period 1. And I've got $15,478.13 left. So now I'm going to put in that I also have speech pathology, and I have that on a Wednesday. So I'm going to highlight the rows or the cells for Wednesday, and I'm going to paste in the $193.99 because that's what my provider charges me for my speech pathology. So now you'll see I've got my weekly spend, and in the first week, because I don't have a speech pathology, it's $193.99, and in most of the other weeks it comes to $387.98 because that's what I've spent for the entire week. And if I have a look at my cumulative weekly spend, you'll see that at the very end of the funding period, I've spent $4,849.75. So that is under my budget of $6,000. So if I go to the header in period 1, my budget was $6,000. I've spent the $4,849.75, and I've got left over $1,150.25. Now let's assume that that's all I'm spending for period 1. Now the leftover budget of $1,150 has been rolled over into period 2. So period 2 starting budget was $4,000, and because rolled over was $1,150, I now can spend in period 2 $5,150.25. So I'm going to go down here and I am going to put in my OT on Fridays and my speech pathology on Wednesdays. So I'll paste both of those in. So the first thing to realize, and I think this is a very important part to remember, is that in my first period, the very first Wednesday of the week and the very last one were not in the period. So there's 12 Wednesdays in the first period. In the second period, you'll see there's 14 Wednesdays. So each of the periods is just 3 months. But based on the day of the week the period starts, how many days are in the month, I could have, as you've just seen here, a variation in how many Wednesdays are in the period. So the example was in the first period 12 and the second period there's 14. So that does make a potential fairly big difference to my budgeting. So now what's happened here, you can see a little bit of orange over on the right hand side. So the orange essentially is warning you that you are spending money a little bit quicker, or potentially a lot quicker, than your budget would allow. So in this particular case, my average budget for, or the amount of budget I had for the first week was $217.39, and I spent $387.98. And probably why I'm spending money a little bit quicker than my budget allows is my budget in the second period is lower than my budget in the first period. If you remember, the budget in the first period was $6,000, and my budget in the second period is $4,000. But I did roll some over as well. But the part in yellow is just telling me I'm burning money at a rate a little bit faster than my budget would allow. And so it's only a little bit over, because in the second week, when my average budget is $304, the $387 isn't a significant amount more. However, by the end of the funding period, in the very last week, I have gone over my budget. When it turns to that orange color, that means my full budget has been spent, including the rolled over amount, and I am now going to be out of pocket. So if I scroll up to the header, it tells me in period 2, my original budget was $4,000. I had $1,150 rolled over. So my combined budget for period 2 was $5,150. I spent $5,237, and that means I have a shortfall of $87.48. So that money of $87.48, I cannot claim that from period 3. The rules are very clear. I cannot spend money in period 2 that was allocated for period 3. So I'll need to pay $87.48 out of my own pocket. And because I've exhausted my budget, there's no money that has rolled over into period 3. So the money rolled over is 0. So let's go down here and let's copy my therapy again, and we're going to have OTs continuing on Friday. And then I'm going to say, well, we want to continue speech pathology on the Wednesday. So in this example, we have now, as you'll see here, we've gone over budget about 3/4 of the way through the period. And that's because, again, we're spending money faster than our budget allows. So if I go up to the top, it tells me in period 3, out of the $4,000 budget, I spent $5,043.74. So I'm out of pocket $1,043.74. So I guess my decision here is, well, I can pay the money out of pocket, which is completely fine. Or if I don't have the money to pay out of pocket, I might decide that I need to reduce the frequency of my therapy. So in this particular case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to move my speech pathology to be fortnightly. So I'll just simply go and click on the delete button on those spend amounts. And you'll now see that for a couple of the weeks in the period, I was spending a little bit more than my budget allowed. But by the end, there was no yellow and no orange, which means I was under budget. So if I scroll up to period 3, there's $4,000 budget to start with. There was no money rolled over from period 2 because I went over budget. And I spent $3,879.80, and therefore the budget left over was $120.20. So for period 4, I've got that money rolled over, the $120. So I've got now a budget in period 4 of $4,120.20. So I'll come down here and I will copy the $193.99 into Friday because I'm continuing my OT. And likewise, I'm going to continue my fortnightly speech pathology. So I'll copy and paste that in there. Now also, I've asked the NDIS to, if I need to create some reports and things for them to go into the next period. And they have said, yes, I need to provide them with some reports. So I'm going to say here, roughly say maybe 7 weeks or so, or you know, a period before my plan is up, I'm going to say I'm going to spend $400 on a report in that week and $400 on a report in the next week. So when I add that in, you'll see that instantly it means that by the end of this funding period, I've gone over my budget and I'll be out of pocket. So if I scroll up to the top, in period 4, my budget was $4,000. I had $120 from the previous period rolled over, but I spent $4,679.80, and therefore I'm going to be out of pocket $559.60. So that means overall I'm out of pocket $647.08 for this whole plan. Now it's quite possible that I can be out of pocket for period 2. Let's say I didn't spend much money in period 4, and if I go down and say, yeah, in period 4 we decided to not do OT, so I'll just delete all of that. Now in this example, in period 4 I had a budget left over of $2,156.26. However, in period 2 I still had to pay out of pocket. So my overall plan was $18,000 budget. I spent $15,931. I had left over $2,156, but I still had to pay $87.48 out of my own pocket, even though for the entire plan I had money left over. I still have to pay that amount out of pocket, and that's just simply the way the rules work. So with the sheet, you can use it to put in what you've already spent, and you can put in what's going to be in the future. So when you log on to your NDIS portal and see your budget, it will tell you what your overall budget is, and it will tell you how much money you've spent, but it doesn't give you any tools to figure out what your future spend might be. And that's where this spreadsheet comes in, is it allows you to play around with the different frequency and doses of different spending you think you might have, and then be able to budget for the future. So that kind of shows you how you work the sheet. And it is, for someone who's not familiar with spreadsheets, you know, you might find it a little bit overwhelming because there's so many columns and numbers and all the rest of it. But it is reasonably straightforward, and I think once people use it a fair amount, then it will just become like second nature. So the other tab, which I haven't shown you yet, the example budget sheet, just simply shows you an example of an 8-period plan with different numbers put in, and you can see down here a little bit similar to what we just did in our example, and it just shows you that so you can have a bit of a play around with an example sheet. So if I wanted to create or look at different scenarios, I could just come in here and I could literally run this again if I wanted to, generate a new sheet, and I'm going to call it category. I'm actually going to just type in here test for holidays, and I'll generate a new sheet, and you'll see what it does is it creates a brand new sheet down the bottom, very similar to the previous one I created, but this one I say it's a test for the holidays because I might be having a big holiday in the middle of the year, so I can create a sheet and see what that might be like for my budget. So let's say, for example, here I'm going to go on a big holiday because I'm going to go and see some family overseas for a number of months. So I might be doing weekly speech, weekly OT, and then here for a number of months I go on holiday. And so then I can go and put in my therapy down in these columns. And you'll see there that there is no orange at all on the sheet. And that means that I have got no out-of-pocket expenses. But I did have weekly speech and weekly OT on the times I was here. And the times I went away to see my family, I didn't spend anything. So you can just make sheets to test different scenarios, and you can create as many sheets as you like. And then in this example, it might be I've decided actually I'm not going to go away on holidays, so I'll just click on the little down arrow here, click on delete, ask me if I wish to delete it, I click on yes, and then that sheet is gone for my test there. So you can create as many sheets as you like to play around with different scenarios. Now obviously the data you enter into the sheet needs to be accurate. If you type in incorrect data, then the sheet is just going to give you incorrect calculations. So you definitely just want to make sure that you've entered in the data correctly. And I'd recommend from time to time logging into the NDIS portal to make sure that the spend amount equals the same amount you've spent on this sheet. So you can make sure, then do a double check to make sure the data is entered all correctly. So if you've got any questions, feedback, suggestions, you can always email on ndisbudgettracker@gmail.com and we can have a look at that. So thank you very much for listening to this video, and I hope the spreadsheet is useful for you.